Argentina has endured multiple financial crises over the last several decades. What was once a rich and prosperous country is now mired in debt, inflation, and currency depreciation. How did Argentina get to this point, and how can countries like South Africa avoid going down the same path? Well, joining me to discuss this is Jonathan Katzenellenbogen, who's a financial journalist who writes a regular column for the Daily Friend online newspaper, and he's written an article which we'll link to below about this very topic. Jonathan, welcome. Can you tell us a bit about the history of Argentina, how it got to this rather woeful point?
Well, up until about the 1930s, Argentina was one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Indeed, it was in the top 10. It was far richer than South Korea in the 1950s. And its downfall began in the 1930s with a import substitution program, the rise of Peronism, the power of the trade unions, and big spending, and with that, big debt. I took on very big debt. And its politics has been such, it hasn't been able to really reach a equilibrium, and it has lurched from crisis to crisis. It has had a total of 21 IMF programs since 1958, which must be an all-time record. Given that many programs last 3 years, or are often truncated in the case of Argentina, because it simply can't meet its obligations to the fund, its performance criteria. That is quite a terrible accomplishment in many ways. And it just lurches from crisis to crisis. Over the past 10 years, its average growth rate has been zero. In September this year, it managed to reschedule its debt, but the bondholders are not very happy with the policies of the present government, and the currency is taking strain. I think they have a fixed exchange rate, and now they're thinking of introducing a wealth tax, which has meant that many of the more wealthy Argentinians are fleeing to nearby Uruguay, which has a far easier tax regime.
So, Jonathan, that is certainly a situation that most developing countries would like to avoid. But it has some interesting parallels with the current situation in South Africa, which is not altogether dissimilar in terms of our rising debt burden, our growing deficits, as the finance minister, Tito Mboweni, highlighted just a week or so ago. So how does South Africa avoid going down the same path as Argentina?
To avoid, in fact, the Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, warned last month about the prospects of he warned of the dangers of the Argentinian way if South Africa didn't deal with its debt problem and stop financing bailing out state-owned enterprises, and come up with cuts and reach a wage deal. He's warned of this many times, but so far he's not been able to implement this. So we're all waiting really until February, when he delivers his budget for the 21-22 fiscal year, to see if he's going to be able to come up with real cuts. In the medium-term budget policy statement delivered last week, he promised some. He said that he warned again of the dangers and said that they were aiming for a freeze. But he's given these sort of warnings before, and it's now turning into an inability to implement. He did this in February. He did this again in the emergency budget, and he's done it now. So it's 3 times this year, and we're really waiting for action.
So, Jonathan, I think that demonstrates how powerful some of the embedded interests are within the ANC. And of course, as you highlight in the article that we mentioned, the Argentine experience was extremely protracted, many decades, and it's very difficult to get out of that kind of position. So how would you recommend South Africa preempts some of those problems and starts to implement the much needed reforms today?
That is the big question, whether some sort of political accord can be reached, whether they can do a deal with their own allies, the unions, the civil servants, and the BE interests surrounding the lucrative tender opportunities within the state-owned enterprises. Can they do a deal? And it's very difficult to see if they can do a deal. The whole situation is going to be a lot worse if they can't do a deal, and it's going to be a lot worse for the interested parties, those in the tripartite alliance, if they can't. And I think it's a very serious situation, but it's also a test of the South African political system. And one of the points that I raised in the article is that Argentina really has lurched from crisis to crisis to crisis. Every time there's an international financial crisis, Argentina and crises of its own making, it seems to be caught and has to go to its bondholders asking for a rescheduling. And it just can't, and that is exceptional in of course, a very negative way. But having gone through 9 debt reschedulings, really impugns the country, and the result has been at certain junctures hyperinflation, as I said, zero growth, bank failures, seizing the assets of its own citizens, and it's in a situation which it can't move, and it had zero growth. 40% of Argentinians, I read in the Financial Times today, are living in poverty. But it's this thing that what I try to highlight is that if you're in a financial crisis, it might go on indefinitely if you can't resolve those basic issues. And those basic issues have economic implications, but they're fundamentally political. And Argentina has demonstrated that it can't do a deal. These issues keep coming up again and again, and it has to satisfy its union interests to carry on, yet it forces it into successive debt reschedulings.
So, Jonathan, I think the lesson from the Argentine experience is that it's very easy to get into that hole and it's very difficult to get out of it. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Jonathan, for sharing your perspective with us. That's it from me, David Ansara. If you enjoyed this content, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and also check out the link in the description below to our 30-day free trial. Until next time, take care.